Discuss Leonard Cohen. And I'm going to discuss both the man and some of the key things in his music and some of his lyrics that are related to predictive programming. Of course, what piqued my interest a long time ago in Leonard Cohen, years and years ago, was First We Take Manhattan. Now, that song was sort of, I'll call it appears, prescient or almost prophetic. Cohen was writing in the 1980s. He wrote this song in the 1980s and performed it at the time. And it says, "I'm coming now, I'm coming to reward them. First we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin." And of course, it has this feel of being a terrorist song. And in the music video, even it's clearly depicting suitcase nuke terrorism along the coast, with lots of people carrying these briefcases in order to perform their terrorist acts. And Manhattan was attacked in a terrorist attack in 2001. And then, of course, it talks about Berlin being taken in the future. And it makes you wonder, well, when's that going to happen as well? And it wasn't just, us reading into it, or me reading into it at the time, or other people too, reading into it, that it's somehow a terrorist song and predictive programming. Even Cohen himself, when asked in an interview about the song in 1988, a backstage interview, I believe in Toronto, he said, "The song is a geopolitical plan that means exactly what it says. It is a terrorist song." There's something about terrorism that I've always admired. The fact that there are no alibis or compromises, that position is always attractive. So Cohen's approach to the song, his understanding of the song, even as far back as the 1980s, was that it was a terrorist song. It is a geopolitical plan that involves terrorism to bring about change. Where? First in Manhattan, then in Berlin. And that's, crazy. Now, of course, he goes on in this interview and he says, "Oh, but, I'm not in favor of, violent terrorism. It's the intellectual kind, like Jesus and Marx and these people whose ideas changed the world for, long times, these sorts of things." But then again, after he said that, what ended up happening is the most notorious terrorist attack of all time, at least in modern history, happens in New York City on September 11th, 2001. And we're still going to be looking for whatever the Berlin attack is. Now, that's not the city of Berlin, almost certainly. I guess it could be, but almost certainly it's not. It's looking back to the Cold War speech of Kennedy, I believe, in which Kennedy said that we are all Berliners, speaking of the free world, people living in the free world at the time, what they considered the free world. And so taking Berlin is upping the ante, so to speak. It's going from just Manhattan to now we get the whole world. We're going to finish it off. We're going to take the rest. And so that's why the song is sung in the way it is. First we take Manhattan, then we take Berlin. It's like, then we get it all. Now the song, before I get into this more, this song is just one song. I'm going to be looking at several others of his songs. They are really interesting. The lyrics are also very important, I think, for some predictive programming elements, especially attacks or persecution of Christians, and also, I think what's also really interesting about Cohen's music is Cohen himself was actually a pretty decent poet. He was trained as a poet. He studied literature at McGill University, and he actually was a published poet working as a writer before he went into music. He didn't become a professional musician until he was in his 30s, a very unconventional path to this career, right? Usually you're in your prime in your 20s, and by the time you're in your mid-30s, 40s, you're starting to see your decline. Your reputation is, fading. Now you're looking like you're almost singing oldies or whatever. Not always, but often it's very rare to start in your 30s. And that's where he was. Now, before that, he was an actual poet. And in his poetry and these lyrics, you get a lot of metaphors that are interesting. But you also see that Cohen himself was a pretty introspective guy, and he was aware of what side he was on. He isn't a guy who was just getting fed some material and go sing it and perform and dance around in a sexy way or whatever. That's not Cohen. Cohen was an educated guy who was singing poetry that, from all appearances, he actually wrote. And it was introspective. It was about him. It was shaped by his life, his mistakes, the demons that plagued him, and these sorts of things. And we can gain some insights not only into what he saw the future being, given his information, but also how he got to the point psychologically, morally, where he was willing to be on that side. He was self-consciously on that side. And he wasn't on that side just to become a famous musician. This isn't a guy who sold his soul to the devil so that he could become a famous musician or rock star. He was a dedicated Mason. Okay, and we're going to look into this. Okay, so we're going to learn about Cohen, and we're going to learn about some of the programming in his music, and we're going to learn more generally about ethics and morality and how people can go from being, educated, otherwise fairly normal people to the point to where they're accepting completely without hesitation being on the dark side, a very evil side, and knowing it and being satisfied being there. Okay, that's, I think, a really interesting thing to look at. Okay, so first thing I'm going to say, though, is how important was Cohen? I don't know. When I mean how important was Cohen in the occult elite, how important was he? In this verse, we take Manhattan Song, for example. It says, "I'm guided by a signal in the heavens." Now, we've talked about that a lot in other videos, and that's dealing with the this pattern in 2001 and 2020, where you have the solstice eclipse, the June 21st eclipse, is followed by the buck moon and Sirius conjoined with in the conjunction with the sun, so where Sirius is not seen in the dog days of summer and all that. And we see this pattern. He says, "I'm guided by the signal in the heavens." And he said it's Father's Day and everybody's wounded. And the Father's Day happens on June 21st this year in 2001 when we have these eclipses. Okay, and so it's Father's Day. It's relevant as well. And here he says, listen, this next one, "I'm guided by this birthmark on my skin." Now, I've always assumed, that's going to be somebody important who has some noteworthy or famous birthmark. Gorbachev or something, right? You think, who has a birthmark that's famous and important that could be important for occult divination or something? But he says, "I'm guided by this birthmark on my skin." What I noticed, I thought, could it be Cohen himself? Now, if his birthmark is guiding planning, it makes me think, well, boy, that's sort of weird. Maybe he's more important than I thought. But if you look, there's his birthmark on the skin. What's that look like? Does that look like that? I don't know. Sort of looks like it to me. But of course, these are marks from IPEC Goat 2, which is representing the Sirius conjunction with the eclipse, the sun after the eclipse. Okay, and so he's guided by this birthmark on the skin, which appears to be related to what? The signal in the heavens. "I'm guided by a signal in the heavens. I'm guided by this birthmark on my skin." And so I look and I think, that's interesting. But I'm not going to dig too much into that. I don't know. But if that, I don't know how it would guide him and planning if he's not somewhat important. But I don't know that he is important. I know in his songs he seems to treat himself as a prophet for the occult elite. Here's a song called "The Future," and here's what he sang in the song "The Future." He says, "You don't know me from the wind. You never will. You never did. I'm the little Jew who wrote the Bible." I don't think this is obviously talking about the actual Bible. I think this is talking about probably their planning, okay? But he says, "I'm the little Jew who wrote the Bible." He says, "I've seen the nations rise and fall. I've heard their stories, heard them all, but love's the only engine of survival. Your servant here. So now he's starting to sound like a prophet. Your servant, I'm here. I've been given a message for you. Your servant here, he has been told to say it clear, to say it cold. It's over. It ain't going any further. And now the wheels of heaven stop. You feel the devil's riding crop. The devil whipping you and making you to go. He's guiding now. Get ready for the future. It is murder. So he takes this prophetic voice and he again is talking about the future. And he says, of course, he has this line here. He says, but love's the only engine for survival. But in the song, you don't get the impression that he's encouraging you to love or telling you to love or giving you hope that you will actually love. He's looking at this as it's hopeless. That's over. It's done. Yeah, that's the only engine for survival, and you won't do it. He says, so I'm here, your servant, and I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. It's over. It ain't going any further. It's done. Get ready for the future. It is murder. Okay? And so he seems to, well, not seems to be, he's claiming to know the future almost prophetically. He's coming to tell you what's coming. That's his job. And here we see there seems to be planning, nations rising and falling in their future, and, of course, murder. I think as a big part of this is the plan to destroy morality. If you look at if we all agree that the press, for example, and the media is in their hands, the occult elite's hands, and they use it to shape our thinking. The media, film industry, and these sorts of things, music industry, if they're using this to shape our minds, our view of the world, and so on, certainly a big part of this, what's been going on from the media, has been the destruction of morality. It's not just that they're planning to blow things up and planning to get us to accept the loss of liberties and so on. They're also getting us to reject anything that's decent morally. Okay? And so we see that throughout the education system. We see that in film, in music, and so on. Okay? So he says, love's the only engine for survival. In the song, he goes on, he says, kill the fetuses, give me anal sex, and something else. I can't remember it all, but the point is he's talking about in the song things that have historically been considered immoral, but now are changing. Things are changing. We're no longer, the wheels of heaven stop. Now you feel the devil's riding crop. The devil is in control here. So now get ready for the future. It's murder. He doesn't give any hope that that's going to be avoided through love. He's just saying that's, in fact, the only way you're going to get out of this, and it's not going to happen. The future is murder. And he even looks at in this song, he talks about the end of the Cold War and how it was better when the communists and the Marxists were in control and protecting morality in some ways. Anyway, so Cohen, I'll say a little bit about Cohen himself. He was religiously a mess. He was a Sabbath-observing Jew who also was a Zen Buddhist monk ordained, who also dabbled in Christianity at one point, apparently, in his songs. He seems to indicate this. He also was a Marxist at some points, and he was a Mason for sure. So look here. So he was a member of the Ionic Composite Lodge, number 520. There he is, Leonard Cohen. Got an outstanding service and dedication of the Lodge Award. Okay, in 1998, he was a past master, a worshipful master of the Lodge in 1993. So he was, head of ceremonies and teaching new members and educating people in the lodge and so on. That's the role of the worshipful master. Okay, so he was important. This is a guy who's in the lodge, who is active in the lodge, who is a leader in the lodge. And he also, in his song, one of his songs that has been released after his death, seems to indicate that he may have been, and perhaps was, a 33rd degree Mason. So if we go here in the song Happens to the Heart, and I'm going to go through that song almost entirely in just a little bit. But this part here is helpful to keep in mind or see. He says, we're always working steady, but I never called it art. It was just some old convention like the horse before the cart. Now listen, I had no trouble betting on the flood against the ark. You see, I knew about the ending, what happened to the heart. So here he's betting on the flood against the ark. He knew it. He had no trouble doing it. He understood what he was doing, and he had no trouble doing it because he knew what happened to the heart. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But then listen to the next line. Next verse, he says, I was handy with a rifle, my father's 303. I fought for something final, not the right to disagree. He didn't want the right to disagree with the people in the ark. He was going to drown them. He didn't want to fight for something like toleration and, let's agree to disagree. You guys be Christians over there and we'll be, occultists over here. Nope. His 303, of course, that's the 33 Freemason stuff, right? He says he fought with his 303. It's a rifle. And he was going to kill with it. Now, he wasn't in the military. His father was, and his father fought, I believe, in World War I. But he didn't, as far as I know. And so when he's referencing his 303, this is a way to make reference to Masonry. Okay, so he is definitely in the occult, right? We know he's in this lodge, his history in that lodge. He was a past worshipful master. He references fighting and being motivated in his life like a war with his 303 rifle, and the goal being to fight for something final, not the right to disagree, including joining the side of the flood against the ark, knowing full well what he was doing. Okay, so this isn't just some idiot, 17-year-old who wanted to be popular and said, okay, I'll sell my soul to the devil sort of thing. This is somebody who arrived in a more deliberate way, more thoughtful way, an educated guy, understood what was going on, was a professional writer, viewed himself as at least having a prophetic role in his music for this cause, and was a leader in a real Masonic lodge. Okay, this is not, I don't know, Justin Bieber or whoever. I'm not to say that he's into this stuff. I have no clue. But, he's not just some kid who got pulled into something. All right. So let's keep looking. So who is Cohen? And what does he have to say in some of his music? So let's look at the song Happens to the Heart a little more closely. Okay. We'll start at the beginning. And what I want to show here, we've already seen the part that's most relevant about predictive programming in that song, his taking the side of the flood against the ark, knowing he's doing that. What I'm going to show in this song is how he gets there. I think we often imagine these people as being, moral monsters in some sort of movie-like sense. Like they're sitting around drinking blood and, killing babies deliberately and so on, are all around him. And I don't know, I'm sure there's terrible rituals that go on, but that's not how he gets there. The way he gets there is through dabbling in the faith, falling away from the faith, having some severe psychological issues as a result of darkness in his life that that entered into his life through sin. Cohen was a guy who was known as a ladies' man. He was a player. Okay, he was often out with women, and he dealt with sexual immorality as part of his life, and he was pretty cold about it, I think. And we see this in the song. And as an old man, he writes this song, and he's reflecting back on his life, and he's saying that he sort of got here where he ended up in life, choosing betting on the flood against the ark. How? Through this sort of gradual death in him and deep darkness within him, this hopelessness and despair that arose through his moral failings in life. Normal moral failings. In another song we'll see, he talks about his demons being sort of mundane. These weren't they're sort of ordinary faults, but they led to hopelessness and darkness in him that made it possible for him to make these choices, which I think is important for us all to realize, because it's not, baby sacrificing and blood drinking that makes someone capable of doing this. It's ordinary sins without hope in Christ that lead people to be capable of doing terrible things. We fall through our own weaknesses and failings like this. And it's much more serious than we often think. So let's go ahead and take a look. He says, I was always working steady, but I never called it art. So he has a very business-like approach to life, right? He was working steady, but he wasn't like an art. Even though he's writing poetry and all that sort of thing, it's business-like. He says, I got my crap together, meeting Christ and reading Marx. So here we see his dabbling in Christianity a little bit, right? His meeting Christ, and at the same time, reading Marx. He was dealing with his handling or getting involved in Marxism. He says, but it failed my little fire. Now, Cohen, we're going to see in this song and in another one, uses this idea of the little fire within us or in people to represent their lives, their inner man, who they are, their soul, their spirit, whatever you want to call it, something like that. He says, but it failed my little fire. It failed my little fire, but it spread the dying spark. What spread the dying spark? Well, meeting Christ and reading Marx, the idea is, at least with respect to Christ, he viewed it as failing him. Christ is failing him. He went to Christ looking for help, looking to escape the suffering that he was dealing with. Okay, and we'll see this in a little bit. And it didn't help his little fire, what was left, right? He has this little fire. It's not a big fire. He's got a little fire, and he's trying to ignite it, get it going, but instead, meeting Christ and reading Marx just killed him. And it seems that he held it against them, at least Christ. Because listen to the next word. It says, go tell the young Messiah what happens to the heart. Now, what's so cold about that line? He doesn't tell the young Messiah what happens to the heart. He doesn't even talk to the young Messiah anymore. He doesn't even care to. He said, you go tell him what happens to the heart. I'm not on speaking terms with him. So Cohen met Christ and fell away from Christ. This would be, it appears, I don't know how extensive his exposure to Christianity was, or this dabbling in Christianity was at the time, but this is the sort of thing that would qualify possibly as, or probably as, the unpardonable sin. Okay? When somebody goes from dabbling in Christianity, knowing Christ, having some sort of faith, perhaps not a saving faith, but having some sort of faith, and then not just rejecting it, but utterly rejecting it. This guy joined the side of the flood against the ark. He says that, right? Knowingly, without any trouble. That's the kind of let his blood be on us and our children approach to Christ after he knew him in some way. And so that would fall into the category of the unpardonable sin. Now, so this is a guy who has fallen from Christ severely. Now let's keep going. And this is where we're going to see a sexual immorality come in. Adultery, infidelity, these sorts of things come in and affect him profoundly. So this older man here writing, looking back at his life, and he says, there's a mist of summer kisses where I tried to double park. Double park, where a car tries to take two spots. Well, he tried to take two women, right, at the same time. Where I tried to double park, the rivalry was vicious. The women were in charge. It was nothing. It was business, but it left an ugly mark. I've come here to revisit what happens to the heart. So in this poem or the song, he's looking back at his life and he's revisiting what happened to his heart. And at the time, to him, this trying to double park, have two women, it was nothing. It was business. He wasn't connected at all emotionally with the people. He was careless, heartless, cold. He sees their rivalry, their viciousness. These women are hurt by what he's done. It was terrible. And here he says, but to him, it was nothing. It was business at the time. But looking back, he sees that it left an ugly mark on him. This was not a trivial event in his life, and what happened to him was not trivial. What happened to his heart? Okay, there was a darkness that's spreading in his heart. Now, this is related to this cold disconnectedness, and it's going to be related to, I think, as we see in the rest of this song and the lyrics, to a kind of despair and hopelessness, right? Because we've already seen at the beginning what happened. It spread the dying spark. It's like his little fire is going out inside him. And what happens with these women in this immorality and his mistreatment of people and his lack of humanity even and decency in dealing with these women is that it left an ugly mark. The fire in his heart, if you want to call it, that's going out. Now it continues on the same topic. He says, I was selling holy trinkets. I was dressing kind of sharp. So you can see his, whatever form of religiosity he had in mind at the time, selling the holy trinkets, maybe in Buddhism or whatever, dressing fancy. But now he says, had a pussy in the kitchen and a panther in the yard. So again, we get now we're using the cat metaphor, but again, the two women, I believe, right? So the pussy in the kitchen, that's the one he's supposed to be with, I suppose, the one he lives with. I'm speculating a little here. And a panther in the yard, that's the wild, exotic, exciting one outside the home that he's not supposed to have. Okay? And so he's got them both. Had a pussy in the kitchen and a panther in the yard. And he goes and now he looks at his coldness again. Now listen, in the prison of the gifted, I was friendly with the guards. What does that mean, right? So we look, the prison of the gifted. What are gifted people often like? Let's think of intellectually gifted people that may have more reason and, sort of cold rationality than feeling, emotion, and the ability to connect in that way, right? So he is in the prison of the gifted. He's a younger guy. He's really smart. He's studied. He goes to the university. He becomes a poet. He's getting some positive reviews on his books. People love his songs, all this stuff, right, as he goes on. And so he's this gifted guy, but he's in this prison of the gifted. He has this sort of, with the giftedness, he also suffers from the concomitant difficulties or challenges, the things that come along with it that are difficult, this disconnectedness and coldness. And so he's in the prison of the gifted, and he was friendly with the guards. He was not making an effort at the time to get out of that. He liked his disconnectedness. He could coldly do this to people, and it was fine with him. The guards weren't his enemies keeping him in. They were his friends. He's fine with that. He's fine being in that environment. He was content being disconnected and emotionally dead, if you want to call it that. Okay? And so he looks at this. And it looks at the situation as an old man. Look back, he says, so because of this disposition and these traits he had, he never had to witness what happens to the heart. Not in the women, he didn't really care. And in himself, he was content to be there. Okay? And so he never had to witness what happens to the heart. But implied is what? It left an ugly mark. He'd already mentioned that. He didn't have to witness it. At the time, he didn't get it. But as he kept doing these sorts of things, he was killing himself inwardly. Okay. Now, he goes on, and he talks about another case a little bit later, I guess, in his life. I'm assuming it's his life. It's part of the story. He says, I should have seen it coming. After all, I knew the chart. Just to look at her was trouble. It was trouble from the start. Sure, we played a stunning couple. So here he's monogamous, it appears. But I never liked the part. So after he had been through everything he'd been through, he wasn't actually content when he tried to live outwardly in the way that he should have all along. He never liked the part. So you see how his heart had changed, right? He's become almost incapable of normal human emotion, affection, connections, love, these sorts of things. And he says, sure, we played the stunning couple, but I never liked the part. It was a show. And this is interesting about Cohen. Cohen was considered a very charismatic and charming guy. But here we're sort of getting a confession that if you understood him inwardly, you'd know that he was just a really sharp guy who understood people and knew how to interact with people in a winning way, in a way that was winsome. Inwardly, he was pretty cold and calculating. And in this case, he never even liked this whole relationship that everybody else apparently thought it was fantastic because, it was a stunning couple, they thought. He said, but we played a stunning couple. It was like playing a role. He says, I never liked the part. And then he's looking back at himself and saying, man, it's almost like in his old age, he reflects on it and says, I blew it. He says, it ain't pretty, it ain't subtle what happens to the heart. Now, we keep going, and what had happened to him through all this? Evil became good, good became evil, everything got turned upside down. And he says, now the angels got a fiddle, the devil's got a harp. You see it? The angel's got a fiddle. The angel's supposed to have a harp, and the devil's supposed to have a fiddle. The devil went down to Georgia. He was looking for a soul to steal. He was way behind, waiting to make a deal and all that stuff. The devil went down to Georgia song. The devil has the fiddle, usually. So switching the instruments with the spirits, the angel's got the fiddle and the devil's got the harp, is a way of saying the angel's bad to him and the devil's good. Now, he says, and every soul is like a minnow. The heart, the inward man, all that stuff's not so important. Every mind is like a shark. So here, we've been talking about these sharks in the iPet Go 2 series, and we've been looking at the sharks. They seem to be thinkers in many cases. For example, Bolton in a book being a shark, or what's his name? The guy with the pandemic. I can't believe his name translates to Jaws, but the point is, it's thinkers, right? And here he in this song is using the mind is like a shark. And Cohen appears to be a pretty informed guy as far as what's going on with their plans. I don't know how far up he goes in planning, but I don't think so. But it seems strange to think he would be. But if he did, but this idea of the shark, it's like a hint. The shark is a mind. They're thinkers. So every soul is like a minnow. Every mind is like a shark. Me, now he's going to look to himself. I've broken every window, but the house is dark. What's he looking at? He's looking at his heart. He's looking inwardly. The spark has gone out, and he is trying everything in his life to get as much light in as possible. He's breaking every window to the soul, if you want to think of it that way, heart, to let the light in. But he still has what? Only darkness. So he's tried everything. What happens when you try everything and nothing works? You lose hope. You despair. And despair is perhaps the most dangerous of sins, right? Because when we despair and lose hope, well, there's no use in trying to do good anymore. So that's when you kill yourself or you do whatever, like Judas, right? Judas killed himself because he didn't have hope of forgiveness. It was an error. He didn't realize that, I guess. He didn't realize that he could go back to Christ and Christ would forgive him. Peter also denied Christ and was saved and blessed and given an important role in life, in the church. But Judas, he didn't. He didn't repent. He went and hung himself because he despaired. Now, here we see what happens to Cohen is he despairs. He says, I've broken every window, but the house is dark. The house is dark. I care but very little. What happens to the heart? He stopped caring. He gave up hope. And so despair is a very important part of this. What's happening to the heart is a loss of hope, a loss of that light, that spark that we have in life when we're young. It's like it just went out through error after error and sin after sin, and not great sins, not baby sacrifices in that sense. Not adultery is a great sin. These are terrible sins. But the point is, these are the sorts of things that happen every day among people in and outside the occult, and it's devastating. And that's why it's so important to have Christ, right? Because with Christ, we have hope and we can overcome these things. Praise God. But if we don't have Christ, like Cohen didn't, and were unwilling to go back to Christ. And he had rejected Christ. Go tell the young Messiah for yourself what happens to the heart. That's it. That was his attitude. When we have that attitude, well, we despair, and now we put ourselves in a very, very dangerous spot morally, where we're susceptible to any temptation to do some of the worst possible things. And it's not because we were enormously different than everybody else and so much more horrible than everybody else. It's that we didn't have hope. Okay, so let's keep going. And he continues, he says, then I studied with this beggar. So now he's going to look at this beggar. He was filthy. He was scarred. How? Again, sexual morality, it looks like. By the claws of many women he had failed to disregard. No fable here, no lesson. No singing meadow lark. What's his point there? Hopelessness, right? I'm not going to give you a lesson. You're not going to get over it. There's no hope here. I'm not giving lessons. There are no moral lessons here, according to Cohen. He's just making observations that this is what happens to the heart. People fall over and over and over and over, and it destroys them. And there is no hope. Christ doesn't help, he says. Marx didn't help. Breaking all the windows to your soul and trying to let the light in from anywhere else doesn't help. He became a Zen Buddhist monk. It didn't help. He was a Jew. It didn't help, right? He did it all, he thought, and it didn't help. And so he's not going to give a lesson or a fable or a moral to a story here. So Cohen's despair characterizes his moral transition in life. He goes from one place to another in his life, and it's in this path of sin, try to get better. He's disconnected so morally, he's disconnected emotionally, and he finally gets to the point where he gives up hope. And now he's ready. He looks back and says, I was always working steady, but I never called it art. It was just some old convention like the horse before the cart. I had no trouble betting on the flood against the ark. You see, I knew about the ending. What happens to the heart? What happens there? He knew. He gave up hope. The heart dies. The heart goes into darkness. That's all. So knowing that, he had no trouble betting against the flood, or betting against the ark. And so he goes to his line, verse here at the end about his Masonic role and what he actually fought for after this point, right? He's despaired. He's given up hope. He's apostatized from the faith. He's abandoned the faith. He's got no role, no place with Christ, no place in the church, no place, no hope from anything. And he says, so he was handy with a rifle. He was a warrior in his mind. My father's 303. I fought. So he fought. This isn't a guy who just sort of towed the line because he had to. He fought for something final, not the right to disagree. How do you get to the point to where you're a guy in the occult who goes around knowingly planning or participating in a plan that will lead to the slaughter of enormous numbers of people, nations falling, people suffering, Christians being persecuted, all that? How do you get there? Hopelessness. You're just a normal sinner. These people are not different from you, me, or anybody else, except lack of hope in Christ. So here he says, I was handy with a rifle, my father's 303. I fought for something final, not the right to disagree. Now here we see this not uncompromising approach of the occult elite here. They are not in it to fight for the right to disagree. Compromise with you, me, and people who are not sharing their values is not a part of their plan. They're not interested in it. They're not interested at all in that. That's not what they're putting all this effort into it for. They're not fighting for the right to give you and me the ability to coexist with them. Okay. So that said, I'm going to call this part one of the Leonard Cohen series because of this part of this series, and I'm going to try to do the rest of this in part two, so we can continue to see what Cohen thought about the future and in relation to persecution of Christians, his own decline morally, and his view of the world that led him to be willing to take the side of the flood against the ark. All right, so like, subscribe, share this video, and all that. Take care. And watch for the next part. I'm going to release that pretty soon.